So first of all, if you're heartbroken when you're listening to vitriol and bigotry, particularly if it happens to be your group, my invitation is to feel the heartbreak.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Lara, host of Radical Acts Uncut. I'm a creative, an entrepreneur, and CEO of Impact PR. Today, I'm speaking with Anu Gupta. He's a lawyer, scientist, CEO of Be More with Anu, and author of the new book, Breaking Bias. Anu has spoken about bias on TED Talk stages and with Oprah, and I had the pleasure of meeting him at the South Asian Journalist Association's 30th anniversary conference during a keynote. As someone who has worked in progressive spaces my entire career, he truly presented a fresh perspective that gave me new insights on bias. So I'm thrilled to have you joining me today.
Thank you so
Welcome.
much for having me. It's a delight to be here with you.
Thank you so much. And can you begin by telling me your origin story and what drew you to studying and investigating bias?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my family, so there's two aspects of this story. There's a personal story and a professional story. So on a personal end, I was born in India and my family immigrated to the US when I was 10 years old. And pretty quickly, I had to learn a new language and find ways to be in my new environment. Pretty quickly, I saw that others weren't seeing me for who I actually was, anew, but they had a whole host of ideas about me and they kind of saw me through that lens. So I was pretty brutally, bullied as a kid. And in light of 9/11, of course, that transferred into a lot of racism and Islamophobia as well. But for me, coming from an immigrant background, I was just taught at home, just swallow it and just, ignore and just move on and just do what we're here to do, which is to succeed professionally. And that's what I did for a while. But it was in college that I began, I went to college to study the hard sciences. I was even a TA for organic chemistry. But I was really fascinated with this idea of bias from an early age, wanted to really understand why are people cruel to one another for no other reason than their being. And, growing up in India and of course, everywhere, I noticed the most clear form of bias, which was in gender bias. And for me, it was receiving a lot of preferential treatment just because I was a boy for no other reason. So that was already like in the back of my mind. So I went into like studying international relations and worked internationally after college in South Korea and Myanmar on issues of economic development and human rights, which eventually led me back to the US where I was pursuing a degree in law, ideally human rights law. But coming back to a pressure cooker environment where, laws, a lot of it is about bias, about racism and segregation, particularly in the US. And yet there was very little discussion of the emotional impact and the psychological impact of bias. And whenever I would bring those things up in the classroom, I'd just be gaslit or ignored or made to feel like, oh, I was just making things up or I was too emotional. And a lot of what I experienced as a young adult just, kind of came crashing up and the self-loathing returned. And I thought that, wow, like there's something wrong with me. So, and I just didn't want to live anymore. So 15 years ago, right before my second year of law school started, I found myself on the ledge of my 18th floor window about to jump off. Thankfully, instead of falling forward into the midtown Manhattan traffic, I fell back into my apartment and had the sense to call someone like immediately. And that person happened to be walking on my block versus being like 3 miles away, which she usually was. So again, divine resonance or something along those lines. And she showed up and we talked for, I don't know, many, many hours. And the next day I began my breaking bias journey, which was really beginning to understand and investigate these ideas that I had about myself, which weren't really mine, but the lenses through which I saw myself. And that, of course, was very connected to why I went to law school, which was around human rights. And a lot of human rights abuses around the world are because of these ideas. And for me, that became very apparent then working in the US within the court system and just seeing the amount of cruelty that kept on being perpetuated to this day, particularly towards Black and brown people, trans people, anyone who's marginalized. And also seeing that, we can change the policies all we want. And a lot of times we have the perfect words and procedures around how to administer issues around equity and fairness. And yet we still have, radical disparities when it comes to people's identities. And that's where I was really, I found that bias is the root cause of every challenge we face. It comes in two forms. And being as someone who was on my own breaking bias journey for myself, I saw the neuroscience and the contemplative science on this, which defined bias as a learned habit. And
Mhm.
just as it's learned, it can be unlearned. So that's kind of been my journey into really understanding the nature of bias from not just a mind science perspective, but also anthropologically, historically, society, contextually, and how we can really evolve human consciousness beyond this idea of bias and why we do this thing called bias to ourselves and one another. So,
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful personal testimony and story about how it impacted your life. And I'm so glad that you're here to continue
yes.
doing the work. And you really hit on something that you said, that bias is a learned habit that can also be unlearned.
hmm
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I was practicing as an attorney for a couple of years after law school and working on issues of racial equity, women's rights globally, queer rights, and wanting to really understand, like oftentimes we talk about these massive disparities we have in healthcare, Black patients, brown patients receiving lower doses of pain medication. Not that the doctors and nurses are racist, but there is some sort of a unconscious coupling where, when we express pain, our pain isn't believed, right? And it's a consistent pattern, and oftentimes by Black and brown providers themselves. So I wanted to really understand like the nature of it, but not just talk about it from an anecdotal perspective, but from a scientific perspective. So that's where I really delved into understanding how bias is actually triggered in the mind. There's kind of three steps I talk about in the book. There's like our senses make contact with another's identity, and that contact triggers a whole host of associations that we have learned about various human identities. And then there's a third step, which is actually our choice. Either we react, which is how we've been trained, or we respond. And that's where the gap really is. And that's what I learned, that there are tools that we have tested. They're actually ancient tools that have been recouched in modern science terminology to help us be in that gap so we can choose differently and respond to bias both within ourselves and in the external environment. And that's what I call the PRISM toolkit.
Mhm.
And PRISM is made up of 5 tools.
And before we get into that, I want to ask you a question that when you think back to your childhood or earlier times, is there an event or an experience that you feel that just kind of contributed to your inner strength and this curiosity that you clearly have about, understanding people and the ways that they think and
Yeah. So, I grew up in, so for the first 10 years, I grew up in Old Delhi. So it's a part of Delhi that's very ancient. So, like from ancient Indian times to kind of the seat of the Mughal Empire in what is in Europe, the age of the medieval age and age of enlightenment. So I'd be around, and I was in a really, really religiously and ethnically diverse, neighborhood. So I'd have friends who were Sikh and Muslim and Christians and Jews, and they're all Indian, but just of all different faith traditions, all different classes. Of course, there was an immense amount of poverty that I witnessed every day. So there was a cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, I grew up in this melting pot of a neighborhood with where people generally lived really peacefully and coexisted next to each other. So diversity and difference was just accepted as a fact of life. And simultaneously, there were two hierarchies that were very apparent. One was around gender, particularly gender roles. For me as a boy, like I was often forbidden from doing any housework for no other reason than I was a boy. It's so common even to this day. And of course, I have two sisters, and they would be very upset, rightfully so. And I would see and I had to really investigate this when I began to really investigate gender bias, just the very unconscious sense of entitlement that would seep in
Mhm.
for no other reason than my being. Like this idea of specialness, this grandiosity, just like seeds that were planted very early on. And the other was really around class and what's known as caste. This was never actually, at least in my family environment, it was never actually said explicitly because I didn't know what caste was until I went to college. In the US, I had to ask my mom, like, Mom, what's our caste? Like, what is this thing that I'm being taught in school? But it was everywhere, particularly kind of witnessing untouchability in India. And it was kind of very coded language that, oh, don't touch folks that are begging on the streets, they're dirty, right?
Mhm.
And little ways. And I was always curious as to, wait, how do they get there? Why are they poor? And why aren't we helping them? Why aren't we doing something about it? So that's kind of where my curiosity really started. And when I had the opportunity to really delve deep into it, that's what I did. And began to see that, oh my gosh, like all of this stuff, like there are five causes to every kind of bias. And it's something we have control over. Like we have the opportunity now. Like we're past the information age. We're in the imagination age. So we have the possibility to really imagine a different way of being with ourselves and one another.
Exactly. And on this show, we unpack tests. And sometimes you receive a test that literally sears a date into your mind that you'll never forget. But
Yeah.
it also inspires you to take action. So can you tell me how January 6th, 2021
Yeah.
connects to your new book?
Oh my goodness. So yeah, that date is seared into my mind. And particularly as we're recording now in election season, it's ever present with me every day, every night. So basically, I started my company, Be More, in 2014, wanting to really discover and identify the root causes of bias and also to create a solution for it. How do we unlearn biases? And I did that. We were funded by the National Science Foundation, American Heart Association. Like I wanted to make sure that it was like a foolproof method that couldn't be attacked. And I've been doing this. I've trained, 100,000 professionals, 300 companies, like kind of your typical like change is incremental, but still a lot of people, a lot of impact. But on January 6th, what I witnessed, just horrid attack on American democracy, on US Capitol, and just witnessing how thousands of Americans, could be manipulated so easily and how deeply entrenched they were in hatred, in separation, in demonization of people like me, basically. And, so I was like, wow, like if I'm even in front of them and I'm someone who's like very much like a meditator or yoga teacher, like I want to bring people together, but they're not seeing me. They're not seeing us. And I realized that it was that moment that I couldn't just continue to train because it was like not even a drop in the bucket in a nation of 330 million with an impact on every single person around the world as the most powerful country. So that's where I was like, when I was meditating and really asking for direction, it was the height of COVID. I was, there was this instinct that said, oh, you have to write a book. Like you have to put everything you know into a book. And at first I was so resistant. I was like, I can't do that. Like I'm not far enough. And who am I to write a book? And how am I going to do it? I don't know how to do it. But once I said yes, it just one opportunity after another. And, 3.5 years later, the book was written and published. And here we are having this conversation.
Yes, yes, that's great. Yeah, and I mean, sometimes it takes again seeing those injustices and actually feeling them,
Yeah.
needing to do something. And again, it's great that you are giving people these tools. Can you actually break down the
Yeah.
PRISM toolkit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say two things. So there are five causes to every form of bias, racial bias, gender bias, and so we can count them on one hand. And then there are five solutions, which is the PRISM toolkit. And PRISM is really a contemplative approach to, rewiring our brains. So the way bias is learned is there's a famous aphorism, neurons that fire together wire together. So conscious biases are really learned false beliefs and unconscious biases are learned habits of thought. So these are associations. So when you think of a surgeon, like who comes to mind? Most likely a male, a white male. Of course we can change these associations, but it's just noticing them and not being ashamed of them, but just noticing how our brains have been trained to see ourselves in one another. So PRISM really begins at M and moves up to P. So the tools that really help us do that is really first is mindfulness, which is just becoming aware of stereotypes. So what thoughts arise, what emotions arise, what affect arises. And this is really important because, when we think of atrocities in our nation that take place every day, particularly police violence towards Black and brown bodies, one has to not just think that, oh, these people are racist, right? Yes, they have racial bias, false beliefs about the humanity of Black and brown people, but what's happening in their nervous system that they have to shoot 20, 30, 40 times to kill someone, right? And that's the nature of bias we're talking about. It's a somatic experience. So mindfulness really helps us, brings to surface and helps us acknowledge, label, feel, and move through the fullness of that experience. And that's really where we begin. Stereotype replacement is now when we notice stereotypes, right? This is again the training from the external environment. We replace it with counterexamples. So in the lab, when we notice stereotypes about Black men, for example, they said, think of Dr. King, and that mitigates because he is a counterexample to that. But we don't have to just think of Dr. King. We can think of our friends and our family members and our colleagues, like who completely defeat those and break through those stereotypes. So it's really about building that intimacy. Then we move to individuation, which is dissociating group-based associations from the individual. So this is about curiosity, interest, investigation. So if I'm with Jacqueline, really with her versus my ideas of her because of, she is a CEO or an expert or a PR professional. So it's really about kind of honing that down and really bringing into the uniqueness of each individual. Then we move to prosocial behaviors. So the R in prosocial. And these are cultivation of positive states like empathy, compassion, joy. And science has shown that cultivation of these tools, particularly using meditation, what it does is it shifts that negative affect, that fear, right? That undergirds bias. We have a negativity bias wired into our nervous system. So what prosocial behavior, these practices help us do is kind of rewire us and gravitate us towards positive mental and emotional states. So we're able to respond better and more skillfully in stressful situations. And last, we go to perspective taking, which is breaking the box altogether, imagining what it's like to be in the shoes of another being. So this is what a lot of creative agencies do, right? When they're doing user research, they're doing empathy mapping. This is what great actors do, right? They haven't experienced what they're, enacting, yet they're able to live into another human being's experience. And that's that's the beauty of this technology that we have of our human body. And these are the tools that over time help us really break bias, really beginning with ourselves, breaking bias toward ourselves, but also toward others, and really building that intimacy. And for me, it's so needed right now with the hyperpolarization in all societies and just kind of healing the divides that exist in our communities, in our families, and of course, in our politics and organizations and companies as well.
Yeah, exactly. And replacing it with a positive association, because I think as people, like we know so many people. So just being able to, whether it's a celebrity or even like your neighbor that that can just start to change thought.
Yeah.
I know in media, we just saw yesterday on CNN, vitriol against on, and I feel like this gets exactly to, what you talk about in your book and what we're seeing. I don't know if you have anything to say about.
Yeah, I do. I have a lot to say. And, I have some Latinx students who wrote to me and they were just like heartbroken. So first of all, if you're heartbroken when you're listening to vitriol and bigotry, particularly if it happens to be your group, my invitation is to feel the heartbreak. And then that's where we work with prosocial behaviors, particularly compassion, self-compassion tools and loving kindness tools to really hold that pain, because what it's doing is it's almost like there's already a wound that exists in our bodies psychologically, emotionally, and it's scraping that wound open. So now we need to treat that wound, right? And this is where prosocial behaviors are helpful and not discount that. And once that heals, I think then we have the ability, because that's what I had to do yesterday when I listened to a lot of that nonsense. And it's really nonsense. Then I was able to depersonalize it. This is not about me. It's about those human beings who happen to be living in this, incredibly violent way of being and a sense of entitlement and superiority, right? That they can put other people down. But this has nothing about me. It's about them. And then that distancing is so important because then that's what gives us agency. And when I reflect on our ancestors, when I reflect on people that, were on the countertops, protesting segregation, or in South Asia, protesting British rule and colonization, this is where they were acting from. The slogan was, I am a man, but that's or I'm a human, like if we want to make it gender neutral, but that acknowledged our equality and our sense of dignity. And we need to do that for ourselves first before we could face the oppressor. So I think that's what's really important. And this stuff is going to continue, sadly.
Yeah, sadly. And can you just talk a little bit about what it means to restory our humanity?
Yeah. So when I say that it's going to continue, is that this is the work of consciousness shift. When I think about breaking bias, there's really two things, If this is liberation work, we're really trying to liberate ourselves and everyone else, right? In the words of Audre Lorde, but also this work is about shifting consciousness. It's moving us from a separation consciousness and exclusion consciousness to one that's inclusion consciousness. So there's a very old, like, indigenous story that indigenous grandfather was telling his son or his grandson that, there are two wolves inside of you that are constantly battling. One is really selfish and competitive and rooted in hatred, and the other is, cooperative, compassionate, rooted in love. And the grandson asks him, well, which one is going to win? And the grandfather says, the one you feed.
Hmm.
So this is what inclusion consciousness is about. And this is what a lot of successful social movements have been about. We see a lot of successful leaders, whether in business or government, they're fueling inclusion consciousness, right? They're fueling this idea of kindness and understanding and joy and love. But then that exclusion consciousness is also there, so we have to balance that out. And this is about us, coming together and overcoming that tendency to hate. And it really starts within. And for me, like looking at this historically, so in the book, I had to go back like 10,000 years. So I kind of blow up across time and space. And I realized that a lot of this has been really about a competition between these two ways of being.
Yeah.
So,
And in your book too, you mentioned though that there's a cost, there's an economic cost to
yeah,
this as well. I think you said estimated 2 trillion.
yeah, annually in the US alone, just for racial bias. So, gender bias, disability bias, sexuality, you name it, right? Age bias. These are really expensive things, right? So it's also a really inefficient way of being. When we assume things about someone, whether it's a candidate that we're hiring or a patient or a civilian, we're not seeing them for who they are and their capabilities and their competencies. We're seeing them as ideas. And that, of course, interferes in the way we show up and we relate to them, which has a cascade of other effects in terms of creating costs. So I think for us, for me, like, if we can get to this, right, we can really transform bias. It's a win-win-win in all, all situations.
Exactly. And if you were given a do-over, would you make your test disappear? The test of writing the book, the test of
Yeah, the test, it's interesting. And I think the first answer is no. Like, I think as difficult as it was, including my breaking bias, I think the first test was really in 2009 when I was on that ledge and kind of took the step of like, okay, well, I'm going to test all these interventions. So I can't, because I think it helped me grow. It helped me understand. It helped me get to know myself so much more. It helped me appreciate humanity. So even when I look at the folks on January 6th or even at the rally yesterday in Madison Square Garden, just cheering on such negativity, there's a sense in me that could relate to their humanity. I don't agree with their behavior. I don't agree with their actions, their words. Of course, they're abominable. And I could see how a human being can end up there. And this is where the consciousness piece is so important for us to appreciate. So, yeah, it's kind of brought me to a place of deep equanimity, actually.
yeah.
And it kind of inspires me and motivates me to continue to do this work.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing the work. And thanks for listening to Radical Acts Uncut. And thank you to Anu. And before we wrap, we also have the Radical Report, which is our crowdsourced segment. So a single leap of faith can change your life, and you never know how your courage can inspire someone else. So write me a 60 to 90-second note that I can read to listeners about your most recent radical act and why it was worth it. You can be anonymous if you'd like, and you can also DM me an audio note. And so today we have Simone Brooks from Houston, Texas writes, I was recently talking to one of my dance students, and she mentioned how she found a dog that had been abandoned for 2 weeks without food and water and left in a kennel to pretty much die. The owners of the apartment said they were shocked to even hear the dog was still alive. My heart was so touched by this story that I didn't even think twice about the long-term needs that the dog was going to have to endure and the demands that the dog would have. So I just blurted out, I'll take her. My decision has completely made me step outside of myself and help out a dog that was in desperate need of a loving and endearing family. So this is something that has radically now changed my life. Thank you very much for that submission.
Thank you, Brooke.
And thanks again to Anu for joining me today. Can you please tell listeners where they can purchase your book, Breaking Bias?
Yes, thank you so much, Jacqueline. And yeah, please learn more about Breaking Bias on my website. It's anuguptany.com. So ANUGUPTANY.com. You can purchase it anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org. You can also listen to it on Audible if you prefer that medium. And then also you can learn more about my work, some of my courses and trainings around breaking bias and well-being at bemorewithanu.com. And you can follow me on socials at Anu Gupta NY and Be More with Anu. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. And please subscribe to Radical Acts Uncut wherever you stream your audio, and follow the show on Instagram at Radical Acts Uncut. And remember to embrace the beauty and the mess.